All right, so to continue this discussion about points of view, I put some notes down, and I want to clarify or reiterate a couple of things. But the basic points that I make here, which I make often, are illustrated in this very simple graphic here, which I'm calling the world stage. And this is the world stage program, which is a closed system. And what it doesn't include are the non-approved conspiracy theories and perspectives. So we'll start with this. The world stage consists of normville, which is the world as presented, not really challenged. Anything fake would be exposed as such. Within the bigger picture, you have the subset of Woketown, which is what you get as you advance to the extreme left. But if you advance to the extreme right, you get Trutherville. And these are parallel systems. You have the critical race theory pill versus the red pill or the J pill. And these are all terms that are used within conspiracy circles to describe what you're oriented around. And so the red pill is a right-wing version of wokeism in which you're confronting the massive conspiracy to control the world. The issue here is that the conspiracies that they all believe in, the people in Trutherville, are supplied to them by alternative media, just as the belief system on the far left is supplied to them through their academia, through their own ideologues on their side. But what you have here is effectively a duopoly. It's a false choice. And each of their major positions are mirrored on the other side because it is pro. And by pro, I mean this is the left, pro-government stance on pretty much anything, pro-mainstream media. It's on their side. And on this side, you have the anti. So a lot of people are on the anti. They're fighting the info war. They're fighting the mainstream. They're woke to the mainstream being a bunch of liars. The problem with pro versus anti is that this is triangulation. So one of the things that characterizes the world stage is everything is triangulated by the programmers. The programmers, the program itself would be disseminated through the programmers. That would be the media. That would be every possible propaganda vector. But the world, as it's relayed to us and as the consensus agrees upon it, this construct polarizes these two sides among this very familiar split, left versus right. And it's not something that can be reconciled. It's actually consistently antagonized. And this is the reason why you have a George Floyd or a Charlie Kirk. Floyd antagonized the left because it was an example of the right wing's oppressive system of capitalism and its associated power structure killing someone who was poor. Charlie Kirk was killed by a leftist crazed Antifa, somebody who was super woke. Or he was killed by Israel. So that's the mainstream Republican or the J pill. But it's the same position. And both sides agree on every major issue as far as what happened. They just fight over who's responsible for it. For example, both sides believe in the idea that the climate's getting worse because of man. The left wing calls it climate change. The right wing calls it geoengineering. The difference here is really just nominal because it's about blaming. The right says, oh, the left, the secret government, the Democrat government, the statists, the deep state, they're using weather weapons to screw up the climate. And the left says, no, the right's doing it with their overuse of fossil fuels because of their political economic system of capitalism, and they don't care about what it does to the environment. So the billionaires cause the climate change. So they tie it into their class warfare narrative. In fact, you could look at the climate as a euphemism for the poor. This idea of rich versus poor, the climate change has kind of replaced the Mother Earth is like the poor. Gaia is the poor. The Earth is the victim of the system. So it's not just the people, it's the Earth, it's the atmosphere. But that aside, every issue is like that. So we're talking about the distinction here is that you have the pro and the anti, which I'm saying is a false choice. The second thing, within this paradigm, news is assumed to be real. Like the news reports a plane crashes or the news reports on any event, and it's assumed to be real unless you at home from your armchair can unequivocally prove it false, which obviously you can't do. And I often state that you cannot completely and entirely deconstruct any event by solely relying on what's on the screen. So that's a fallacious approach anyway. It's just it appeals to the authority of the screen. And I'm saying at this point, we have to move past the reliance on it because everything is so fakeable. But the base assumption is that news is real, but the left has a bias, the right has a bias. And their second assumption here is that recent history is largely objective. Because there are people in this who believe in history, but they know that the rich write the history, the left and the right fight over who's responsible for slavery, etc. So you have this kind of fight over it retroactively. But recent history, as reported by the news, is assumed to be essentially real. Like you pick up a history book, but the thing is, everything in the history book is going to comport with what the mainstream has published. So they're, again, built-in assumptions here. That's really what I'm talking about. So if you are in this world stage model, you are also a believer or an alternative believer. That's the pro and the anti. You got believers in the program, the world stage model as presented, and then you have the alt believers. They're not non-believers, they're alternative believers. Major distinction there. So your point of view, if you are, and this is only regarding media. I mean, this has nothing to do about what people's professions or how they live their lives or what they know about as far as their own field of endeavors, but I'm specifically referring to media consumption. So as a media consumer, if you are framing your interpretation of the news through what has been presented through conventional outlets, you're world stage centric. So you're living in a world which has been infused with whatever the media's put into it. But my point being, this is your primary source and you accept it passively. And this is true whether you're mainstream or alternative. You're passive in the sense that you're dependent on the external source to tell you what's happening. And then you debate over that. And the other aspect of it being passive is the built-in assumption that what you're shown is enough to have a conclusion. Like I saw enough on TV to agree that it happened or to assume it happened if I can't prove it wrong, which is an inversion of the burden of proof. The people who are in this model are unaware that they're in it. People in Woketown don't know they're in Woketown or what that means. People in Trutherville don't really know what that means because they assume that since they call themselves truthers, that they are the truth because they're opposing the lies. So the assumption here is that being anti, being the resistance, is somehow doing some good, when in fact, it's a steam valve and it has co-opted you into being part of the controlled opposition to the pro, who are controlled, and they oppose the anti. So the concept of controlled opposition needs to be expanded from beyond just influence agents trying to get into your social media and influence how you think, but I'm suggesting that the entire media being controlled is set up in this triangulation in opposition to one another. It's a duopoly, but they play this game, this back and forth, but they don't allow any sort of competition. You'll notice there's no platform for non-believers. So what are you? Are you a believer like most people in your life? And this isn't a criticism, it's just the objective fact. Most people in your life are normville believers. If they go to college, they're probably Woketown believers. If they didn't go to college, if they didn't get the leftist indoctrination, if they're online a lot, there's a pretty good chance they got sucked into, especially like there's so many avenues to pull you into these pockets. It wouldn't take very much to pull somebody into Alex Jones type Trutherville, which is somewhat, from the outside, it looks kind of innocuous. These are just conspiracy theories, tinfoil hat, they joke around. But the truth of it is, it positions you on the woke end of the spectrum on the right, because red pill is actually a subset of the J pill premise. So again, believers and alt believers, these are the two options you have. What is your perspective? If you're not believing the mainstream and you are not leaning left, but you are you're not Antifa and a true believer in that. Like if you're a conspiracy theorist, if you're a free thinker, if you don't trust the news, you're pretty much in the anti position by default. And you're hit with all these alternative stories and characters who are promoting them, people like Candace Owens. But again, I'm just pointing out that these are the only real perspectives, because the other perspective that I'm talking about isn't included in the box. Thus, the explanation of it being off-world stage. So here's the difference. The off-world stage, as opposed to the passive mode of processing media, is more active. In other words, we're proactively looking for more information to substantiate the claims that are made by media. We're not assuming them to be telling the truth. So the off-world stage perspective maintains, one, history is proactively manufactured. If you acknowledge the existence of even one successful psychological operation, then you have to at least admit that you recognize that this claim is valid, that events that steer news cycles and thus history are in fact scheduled in advance. We can debate on how far in advance, but at a minimum, we're talking about history is not just retroactively retconned into your particular agenda, but it is in fact proactively created, which has significant implications. Makes me think that the electoral politics might all be rigged. I mean, the mayor of New York, the plane crashing, these things are too synchronized. Now, these events are what are typically called psyops. You could say fake news, simulated events, but this is how they fake history. They insert fake events, they inject synthetic events into our shared timeline. Our shared timeline is our history. It's the agreed upon version of things. But those of us who don't believe these events, who look at how history is actually bent, have to take, therefore, a different perspective. So instead of being believers or alternative believers, we are non-believers, meaning we know what they believe, but we subtract what we can't verify. So we're informed disbelievers. So we know very well what's in their Bibles. We just don't adhere to their religions. We're not coming from a place of ignorance. So we're not pro, we're not anti. We have to take the position of anti-pro, anti-anti. So if anything, our position is non-participants in the Psy War. And what informs our perspective of any event is the recognition of the consistent use of special effects, mass media, influence ops, and we have recognized that media has a track record. It is a proven liar. PSYOPs are scheduled likely years in advance. So what I'm pointing out here, even if they weren't, that's a controversial claim for many, but we're going to go there. But at a minimum, we're looking at real-time manufacturing of historic events, significant events that influence geopolitics as a regular feature of mass media, systemic fakery. So systemic fakery is a thing. It's real. It's been in use for a long time. It has an accumulated effect on our worldview because every day of fake news becomes weeks, months, years, decades of fake history, bent history. We've deviated from the objective with what they've added into it. So where does that put us? Well, we may not know exactly what is being ignored because of the worldview shapers are able to focus only on what they want to spotlight. So we may not have more beliefs or answers, but we have more questions. But I think it's better to have questions than to have wrong answers that make you think you don't need to ask questions. They give you a false sense of enlightenment. So our perspective from the IPS think tank is the off-world stage perspective, which informs our interpretation of every story. That's why it shocks me when somebody who knows very well that 9/11 was theater sees the plane crash and thinks it's real just because it's on TV. And it's like, you realize that this thing is 9/11 coded in so many ways, and it's the same production company. Or they think Charlie Kirk, I don't know, maybe looks like he got killed. Well, these are the same people who know that Donald Trump faked his ear wound. It's the same liars. There's a continuity. And that's why I think it's so integral that you keep in mind that fake news on the timeline never gets corrected. It builds up. And if you follow these stories, you follow their trajectory, you can see how this can lead us collectively into a worldview enhanced, infused, manipulated, contorted in such a way that we are synchronized to what you could consider to be a worldview monopoly. This is the essence of worldview warfare. So the psychological warfare campaign against humanity is ongoing. It's largely successful. I'd say close to 100%. The off-world stage perspective doesn't have a platform in here. So we've formed a breach right out of Trutherville. You don't go from normville to off-world stage. There's a couple of leaps there. So we have formed a breach. So we're out here where the programmers are, the metascriptors. Although most of the programmers are at least 90% submerged because they're not let in on everything, it wouldn't make sense. It would compromise the mission. It's a hierarchy. It's a security clearance society. But we don't have security clearances. We don't have blood oaths. We didn't sign our names in NDAs, but rather we examined the system, determined what it was and how it works, what its purpose is, and we opted out. So truthers, alternative media types, they didn't opt out of the world stage. They're actually fighting within it. They're in the nightmare. They're in the dream. But this is an opt-out. This is conscientious objection to the Psy-War. And we are correct in our assessment of how events are manufactured and how it is not just the news, but how it encompasses an entire spectrum of media platforms, personalities, includes politics. It's an entire media ecosystem that only appears to be compartmentalized to the uninitiated. Luckily, we don't have that problem. So we'll be back later today to discuss this and much more. Thank you for your support of the channel. And I'm going to take a picture of this, run it through AI, and see if it can turn it into a legible infographic.